They married me to a dead man. That is what the whole county believed the morning I was carried across the moor to Fenwarren Hall, that I had been wed by proxy to a corpse who had not yet had the courtesy to lie down, a scarred recluse the fire had half taken 3 years before, and was taking still, by inches, so slowly that the parish had already sown its mourning, and only wanted the date. They were wrong about him in every particular, though it took me a single held breath, kneeling on his cold floor with a pin between my teeth, to know it. Come closer to the fire, if you will, and let it warm your hands, for this is a long tale and a cold country it happens in, and I will tell it to you plainly, the way I was taught to tell one seam from another, without hurry, and without leaving out the part that matters. My name, in the years this happened, was Mercy Lovell, and I was a maker of gowns and a mender of what lay under them, and I had been sold up the steps of a great house that would have barred its door against me had its master's people known what I could read. Let me begin where the county began it. Days after the wedding I did not attend, in a carriage that smelled of wet wool and old leather, going up onto the brown moor, under a sky the color of a pewter plate. I had never seen my husband. A proxy had stood in my place, they said, at a distant altar, and another man's voice had answered for the Marquess of Fenwarren, who was too unfit and too much a hermit to be moved, and so I was a wife to a face I could not have picked from a crowd, bound to a name the length of the county spat when it said it. The house came up out of the moor the way a wreck comes up out of a gray sea, all alone, one long gray Jacobean pile of stone with its chimneys cold, and one whole wing of it burned black and shuttered. The windows of that wing boarded like closed eyes. I looked at that black wing a long time as we came up the drive, and I did not yet know I was looking at the first grave, but I marked it the way I mark a bad stitch in a hem. Something done wrong here, and hidden, and not by accident. They took me up almost at once. There was no dinner, no rest, no easing of a bride into her new rooms. There was a smiling, fair-haired gentleman in a bottle-green coat who called me cousin and pressed my hands too warmly and steered me, before my cloak was fairly off, up a dim paneled stair lit by too few candles, saying all the while in a low, sorrowing voice that his grace was very low indeed, that I must not be distressed by his appearance, that the poor man had wished, such as he could wish anything now, to have his mourning clothes fitted while he yet had strength to stand for the pinning. Mourning clothes. You will understand, they had sent for a seamstress wife not to clothe a living man, but to measure a dying one for the grave he would be buried in, and they told me so on the stairs as though it were a kindness, and I said nothing, and I let the smiling cousin open the door. I want you to sit with me a moment before I take you into that room, because what happened in it is the whole hinge of the thing, and I would not have you rush past it. Have you ever been priced by people who never once troubled to ask what you were worth? Weighed up at a glance, tallied like a length of cheap stuff on a shelf, and sold on at the figure a stranger set on you, because you were poor, or plain, or without a soul in the world to stand up and ask a hard question on your behalf? If you have, then you already know the particular quiet that comes over a person who has been so priced. You do not weep. Weeping is for those who still expect to be heard. You go very still instead, and you begin, without a word, to count. That is what I did on those stairs, and that is what I did when the door swung in on the man they meant me to bury. So keep your seat, and I will tell you what I saw, and then I will tell you, before we are done tonight, exactly what I did about it. For this is not a tale of a woman who was wronged and wept, but of a woman who kept the receipts and read them aloud at the last, before the whole assembled county in a candlelit hall, until a smiling man's face did his confessing for him. But every account has a first entry, and mine began on my knees on that floor. Let me first tell you how I came to have eyes that could read it, for I was not born knowing. I was raised to it, the way another girl is raised to the harpsichord. My father was Thomas Lovell, a tailor by his trade and, by the harder half of it, the layer out of our town. The man they fetched in the night to wash and dress and make decent the dead. And the man the old soldiers came to in the day, the ones the wars had sent home maimed, to have their ruined bodies measured and eased and clothed, so that a man with half a face or one arm might still go into the street looking like a man and not a wound. My mother died bringing me, and my father, having no son, raised his daughter to be one at the needle and at the table both. He did not spare me. Before I was 10 he had my hands in the work, and before I was 14 there was little that came through his door, living or dead, that I had not seen and helped with and been made to name. And the thing he taught me above all the rest, the thing that is the whole of my trade and the whole of this story, is that the skin keeps its accounts exactly as the cloth keeps its seams. A body is a garment, he would say, that God cut and stitched and will one day unpick, and every mend that is ever made in it leaves its mark in the making. And those marks can be read as surely as I read a torn hem and tell you whether it caught on a nail or was cut with a blade. A scar's ridge tells you the edge that made it, clean and straight for the knife, ragged and broad for the tearing, puckered and shining for the burn. Its color tells you the years, angry red for the new, brown for the season old, and silver, that soft, dead silver, for the wound of long ago that has finished its healing and set. And a wound will tell you, if you have the eyes for it, whether it was closed clean and let alone to knit, or whether it was kept open, worried, or fouled, or fed something that would not let it close. All of it, every case that passed under his hands and then under mine, we wrote down. My mother had left a book, a thick stitched book of dress patterns in her own neat hand, and my father let me fill its empty leaves and its margins with our other patterns. The patterns of wounds, drawn and noted in a little private shorthand of my own devising that no living soul but I can read, a code of ticks and loops that says in half a line what a physician would take a page to say and still say wrong. That book went everywhere I went. And he taught me 3 laws, and made me say them back until they were under my tongue like my own name. The first, read before you touch, for the hand that is busy cannot see, and half of what a body has to tell you it tells in the first look, before you have laid a finger on it and changed it. The second, a wound is a question of dressing as much as of depth, that it is very often not the hurt that kills but the tending of it, and that what is laid against a sore matters as much as the sore itself. And the third, the one he set most store by, that the cure of most festering in this world is a clean hand and honest linen, and that where a wound will not heal under good plain care, you must stop asking what is wrong with the wound, and begin asking what is being done to it. Hold those 3 laws in your mind if you please, for you will watch me use all 3 before this candle burns down. My father died of a fever when I was 22, quick and unfair, in 3 days, and with him died the little independence I had. The shop and the lease and the good name did not come to me. I was a woman and unmarried, and such things do not. They came to a grasping connection of my father's, an aunt by marriage and her sour son, who saw at once that they had inherited not only a business but a workwoman who could not leave it, and who need not be paid. 4 years I stitched for them for my keep, and not a shilling over. 4 years of other women's wedding clothes and other women's mourning, while my own hands roughened and my own prospects closed one by one like shops at dusk. I tell you this not for your pity, but so that you will understand the sum I did in my head the afternoon the Fenwarren lawyer came, and why I did it cold. He was a dry, careful man in a dusty coat, and he laid the terms on the counter between the pins and the chalk as if he were laying out cards. His client, the Marquess of Fenwarren, was gravely ill, dying, though he did not use the word twice, of burns 3 years old that would not heal. By the terms of the late Lord's will, the present Marquess must be married before Lady Day, or the whole estate would slip sideways to some further branch, and so a wife was wanted, and wanted quickly. The lawyer read me the specification as though from a bill of goods, and I have never forgotten a word of it, for I have been in trade all my life, and I know a specification when I hear one. A bride of respectable character, of sound health, of modest station. And here he did not look up from his paper, and that not looking up told me more than the words, of few connections. Married by proxy, for his grace was far too unfit and too retired to attend a church. In return, a jointure settled on me, and my aunt's debts quietly eased. Now you have been in the world, you tell me what you would have read in that. Respectable, healthy, modest, married sight unseen, and above all with few connections, with no father, no brother, no uncle, no friend of any standing to come knocking and asking, some cold morning not far off, how exactly it was that his Grace's poor young widow had come to be a widow so soon. I read that specification the way I read a label sewn into a coat, plainly, and to the end. They did not want a bride. A bride is a great deal of trouble to a family with plans. They wanted a widow, made to order, one with no one behind her to ask a question. I sat with that for the length of a breath, and then I did my sum. I was 26, unpaid, unfree, and going nowhere but slowly downhill in a house that was not mine. They were offering me a title, a settlement in my own name, and a house, and, though they did not mean to, they were offering me the one thing 4 years of drudgery had taught me to value above safety, which was a door of my own that another person's greed had opened by mistake. And there was a third thing in my sum, though I did not say it aloud even to myself in words so bald, only felt it, the way you feel a knot in the cloth before your eye finds it, that a family which wants a widow so badly is a family that is doing something to someone that will not bear a witness. And I had spent my whole life being trained not to startle, and to look very carefully at exactly the thing everyone else in the room is trying not to see. So I accepted. I accepted quietly, and I made but one condition, and I made it small and soft and sentimental so that no one would trouble to weigh it. I asked only that I might bring with me my late mother's workbox and her books of patterns, for sentiment's sake, for a poor bride's comfort in a strange house. The lawyer granted it without so much as a glance up from his blotting. What could be more harmless than a bereaved seamstress and her mother's needles? And so into the carriage, wrapped in an old shawl and set on the seat beside me like a second passenger, went the japanned black workbox with its folding brass tape measure and its bone bodkin and its rows of needles, and inside it, under the reels of thread, my mother's stitched book, the book of patterns that was also in its private hand a book that reads bodies, carried up the steps of a house that would have flung it and me back down them into the mud had any soul under that roof understood what was coming through the door. There, now you know what I was, and what I carried, and why I was cold. Let me take you back up the dim stairs and into the room, for we have kept his Grace waiting, and the cousin has his hand upon the door. The household had gathered itself to receive me, in its fashion, and I read them one by one in the first hour as I read the will's specification, which is to say quickly and to the end. There was the fair cousin, Mr. Crispin Vale, handsome and smooth and about 40, with wavy fair hair and pale blue eyes as cold as pond ice, and a warm, easy smile that stopped short of them every time. The acting master of the house and the steward of the whole estate, the man whose hand was on everything, and whose welcome was pitched a full tone too warm, the way a shopman's voice goes up when he is selling you damaged goods. There was a dowager aunt who wept softly into a lace handkerchief at nothing in particular, and looked at me as one looks at a necessary expense. And there was the surgeon attendant, a Mr. Dampier, a sleek, soft-spoken man of about 50 in rusty black, his thinning gray hair combed flat to his skull, his fingers ink-stained and careful, a worn leather dressing case forever under his arm. The man, they told me, who dressed his Grace's wounds morning and night, twice every day, from a squat brown gallipot of dark salve. And I marked, as I was handed from one to the next, a thing so small and so constant that it made the hair rise on my arms under my sleeves. Every one of them, when they spoke of the Marquess, spoke of him already in a past tense. Not the words, quite. The words were all of the present. His Grace is resting, His Grace will be so glad. But underneath the words, in the way they said them, he was already gone. They spoke of him the way people speak of a man over whose coffin they have already chosen their black. And they had, I would learn. Then the door opened, and I went in expecting, on the strength of everything the county said, to find a broken creature, a burned madman gibbering in the dark, a ruin. What I found was a tall, lean man of about 35 sitting very upright in a great chair by a low fire, wrapped in a loose, dark banyan of bottle green over a plain linen shirt. A black silk half-mask laid across the right of his face, where I could see, even so, the drawn silver of old burns running down his cheek and neck. And above the mask, 2 dark, deep-set eyes came round to me. And they were not mad, and they were not broken, and they were not gone. They were bitterly, terribly awake. It is a thing I have no good word for. That look, it was the look of a man buried alive who has stopped shouting because he has learned that shouting spends the air, and who watches the little grill of light in his coffin lid with a patience that has murder in it. He looked at me, this bride he had never asked for and never seen, and he said, low, in a voice roughened but perfectly steady, that I must not think this marriage any devising of his, that he had had no more choice in it than a beast has at a fair, and that he was sorry, more sorry than he could make civil, that I had been brought to so poor a bargain as himself. And I, who had meant to say nothing at all, heard myself answer him. I said that he need not spend his sorrow on that account, for nobody had chosen it for me either, that I had not been chosen, only priced, and that we were, in that at least, fellows. And something moved behind those bitter eyes, something turned, and came up out of the deep of the man, and looked at me, Mercy Lovell, and not at the useful widow-to-be or the seamstress sent up to measure a shroud, looked at me as though I were the first live thing to come into that room in 3 years. Then the moment closed, and Mr. Dampier was murmuring at my elbow that his Grace tired quickly, and the fitting was set to begin. They stood me at his side with my pins and my chalk, and I knelt to my work as any seamstress kneels, and I began, God help them, to read. Remember the first law, read before you touch. I read him before ever my pen went in, and in one held breath, on my knees on that cold floor with the gray cloth in my hands, I caught 3 things at once, and each of them was a lie the whole county had been told. The first came to me on the air, a smell. As I bent close to pin the loose cuff at his wrist, the fresh dressings under his sleeve breathed at me, and under the honest small stink of a wound there was a wrongness, a faint sweetish reek that had no business in any wholesome sore. A smell I knew, a smell my father's soldiers had never once carried, a smell of something added. That was the first entry. The second I took with my eyes as I steadied his forearm to pin, for the sleeve fell back a little, and I saw the wounds themselves, and they stopped the breath in me though my face never moved. There, up the arm, were the old burns, gone that soft dead silver of years. 3 years, 4, set and finished, done healing long ago, and sitting on top of that silver, right on top of the old set scars, were fresh sores, raw and red and weeping, angry as a thing a week old. Now hear me, for this is the whole of it. A burn that has silvered has healed. It is closed. It is a shut account. Fresh weeping sores do not rise, of their own accord, 3 years later, upon skin that finished its healing before. Wounds that have set do not come open again by themselves. Something was opening them. Something was keeping them open. That was the second entry, and my hands, which had washed my dead father and never shaken, did not shake now. A layer-out's daughter is trained clean out of startling, and thank God for it, for had I gasped on that floor, I do not think I would be alive to tell you this. And the third thing I read in the shape of the old scars themselves, and it was the third lie, and the largest, and the one that turned the whole county story inside out like a stripped sleeve. The whole country said this man had set the fire, had burned his own wife to death 3 years gone, and been marked by his own crime, an arsonist scarred by the blaze he lit. But a fire marks a man according to what he did in it, and the skin keeps that account too. A man who sets a fire and flees is burned behind and along, on the backs of the hands, the outsides of the arms, the shoulders, as he turns and runs from the heat at his back. This man's burns were on the fronts of his forearms and, worst and deepest of all, seared into the palms of both his hands, ridged and shining. The very grip of the fire printed into his flesh. Those are not the burns of a man running away. Those are the burns of a man who reached into the fire and took hold, who thrust his bare arms into the flame and closed his scarred palms on something in it and would not let go. Those are a rescuer's hands. I knelt there with a pin in my fingers and read, off the naked skin of a man the whole world called a wife-killer, the plain printed record that he had gone into the fire to pull her out of it, and had failed, and had been blamed for the failing, and had been left, ever since, to a household that spoke of him in the past tense, while it kept his old wounds fed and open with something sweet and wrong. I read all 3 lies in a single breath, and then, because the first thing my father ever taught me was that the hand that sees must never let on that it has seen, I finished the pen. I set it clean and true through the gray cloth, and I smoothed the cuff, and I filed every particular of what I had learned in the ledger of my head where no one could get at it, and I said nothing at all. Not a word. I only marked, as I rose, that the surgeon, Mr. Dampier, was watching my face very closely to see whether the poor shopwoman had been frightened by the sight of the sores, and I gave him a shopwoman's small, squeamish flinch to feed on, and he was satisfied, and looked away. Now you will want to know what I did, and I will not keep you waiting for the shape of it, though the whole of it takes the rest of this tale to tell. I could not, you understand, cry murder on a smell and a theory. I was a nobody 1 week wed, a bought bride with roughened hands and no soul in the county to speak for me. Had I run down those stairs crying poison, they would have wept over my hysteria and dosed me, and in a week I too should have taken a bad fall or a low fever. And the parish would have shaken its head over the poor mad bride and buried us both and pitied the noble cousin his trials. A theory is nothing. A smell is nothing. What is something, the only thing that is ever something, in the end, against people who have money and standing and a smiling face, is proof set down, dated, sealed, and kept, where they cannot reach it. So I did not spend words. I resolved, kneeling there, to spend proof. And I began the very next morning, under the meekest cover in the world. I went to the cousin and to the surgeon with my eyes down and my color up, and I told them, stammering at my own boldness, that it was a foolish notion of my mother's people, a superstition of our humble sort, that a wife's own hands should tend and clothe her husband in his sickness, that it was thought to bring a blessing, and ill luck to refuse it, and I begged, as a new and anxious wife, to be let nurse his grace and make his linen with my own hands. The cousin's cold eyes weighed it, and found it charming and harmless and, better than harmless, convenient. A devoted little wife nursing the dying man kept up the very picture he wished the county to hold, and he granted it with his warm, empty smile, and so I was given the freedom of the sick room, and with it the keeping of the dressings. And from that hour I began, quietly, above stairs, behind the meek face of a fond wife, to fight them on their own ground with the only weapons I had ever owned, a clean hand, honest linen, my mother's book, and a candle. I read his wounds properly now, at my leisure, against the wound notes in the book, and everything my one held breath had told me was confirmed twice over. The salve in that squat brown gallipot, the dark salve Mr. Dampier worked into the dressings twice a day, had a caustic in it, a corrosive worked cunningly into an honest-seeming ointment, a thing that ate at flesh and would not let a wound close, and it was that, and only that, and not any lingering hurt of the old fire, that was keeping this strong man weak and feverish and gray and dying by the calendar. But I did not say so. I did a harder and a slower thing. I kept everything looking exactly the same while I changed everything underneath, twice a day, at the very hours the surgeon had kept. Before the very eyes that expected it, the dressings were changed as ever. But what went on now was clean linen of my own, and an honest salve I compounded myself in the still room, matched to the eye and to the nose, so near to Dampier's poison that no one glancing in could have told the difference. And what came off? Every doctored dressing I stripped from that man's arms, I did not burn and I did not throw away. I carried it to my chamber, and I sealed it with a drop of wax, and I wrote upon it the day and the hour and the wound it came from in my own plain hand, and I locked it in the japanned workbox with my mother's needles, row upon row, day upon day, a growing account of sealed and dated evidence laid down under the reels of thread. And every night when the house was abed, by the light of one candle, I ruled a chart in my father's shorthand, a ledger of that man's healing, the color of each wound, its weep, the state of its edge, the height of his fever, the retreat of the sores down his arms, joint by joint, day by day, in a private hand only I could read, but that any honest physician could be walked through, mark against sealed mark, if ever the day came to walk one through it. That was my campaign. No scenes, no tears, no accusations flung down a stair, only a clean hand, honest linen, a wax seal, and a candle night after night. And it worked, cell by cell, day by day. The man they had all measured for his grave began to climb back up out of it. The fever loosened its grip and let him sleep. The grayness went out of his skin. The sores, unfed at last, began, for the first time in 3 years, to do what wounds do when they are simply left clean and alone, which is to close. And I kept it hidden above stairs, and when the smiling cousin came on his solicitous visits, I saw to it that his grace was found low and gray and bent in his chair as ever, so that the county went on being told, in the cousin's own soft voice, that the poor Marquess was sinking. But he was not sinking. He was rising, in secret, under my hands, and one gray afternoon a fortnight in, when we two were alone, he set his scarred palms on the arms of the great chair, and he stood up straight and unaided, who had not risen without 2 men to lift him in longer than I had known him, and he lifted one hand and turned it in the light, and looked at the sores upon it that had closed, in that fortnight, to smooth new pink, and he looked from his own healing hand to me, standing quiet by the window with my needle, and he said, "Lo, in that steady, roughened voice, madam, what is happening to me? Men do not mend of what I have." And I looked back at him, and I did not lie to him, though I did not yet tell him all. I said, "No, no, they do not." And I let it lie there between us, that one small true thing, and said no more, while behind me, locked in my mother's workbox under the thread, the first sealed row of the account grew longer by a day. She did not answer his question that first night, because the true answer was not yet finished, and Mercy Lovell had been raised never to read a sum aloud until the last figure was set down, but the men who had married her to a dying husband heard the silence he could not, and they did not like it. A corpse keeps to its schedule. A corpse laid out for Lady Day does not rise from its chair and flex a pink hand, and Crispin Vale, who had reckoned the whole of Fenwarren down to the week, began within the fortnight to find the arithmetic wrong under his fingers, and a man who has planned a death to the day grows nervous when the death is late. It began, as these things do, in the language of kindness, for that was the only language spoken aloud in that house. Over the cold roast at the foot of the long table the cousin let fall, in his warm honeyed way, that he had been thinking, dear Mercy, only thinking, that his grace was not mending as they had all so fervently prayed, and that it was a great weight on so young a wife to nurse a great man to his end with none but country hands about her, and that he had half a mind to write to town for a cleverer surgeon, a real physician of reputation, who would know things poor faithful Dampier could not, and might it not be gentler, he wondered, to move his grace to the south rooms where the sun lay warmer, away from the draughts of this wing, away, he did not quite say, from you, and to engage a proper nurse, a stout, capable woman, so that the dear child might rest, and not wear herself to a thread over a case that God had plainly already decided. He said it all smiling, and the dowager pressed Mercy's hand across the cloth and called her a brave, good girl, and the surgeon, Dampier, folded his ink-stained fingers and murmured that of course a second opinion could do no harm. Though he feared very much. It came too late, and Mercy, who understood every word of it exactly as a draper understands the true width of a bolt when the seller quotes it generous, understood that they meant to take her husband out of the one pair of hands that was saving him, put him behind a bought nurse and a bought physician in a warm far room, and finish there, quietly, what her clean linen had interrupted. And she smiled back with her eyes cast down and said that they were all so very good to her, but that she had made a foolish girl's vow before God to tend her Lord with her own hands while breath was in him, a superstition of her poor mother's people, and she could not break it and be easy, and she would sooner die herself than let a stranger dress him. And would they forgive a bride her one stubbornness? and because meekness is the one performance no proud man ever troubles to see through, they let her keep him. And Crispin Vale went back to his wine believing he had merely to wait out a sentimental chit, and that, if you will mark it, was the second mistake that family made in front of the one person alive who was counting them. Then the parcel came. It came by the common post from town, done up in shop paper and string, and inside lay a roll of the finest soft dressing lint, bleached white as snow, with a card in a fair clerkly hand, with an old friend's compliments for the easing of his grace's hurts, and no name. And Mercy carried it up to the sewing room and did not put it near her husband's skin, because a layer-out's daughter opens no man's gift over an open wound until she has asked the gift what it is made of. She snipped a thread of it and drew it under her nose and knew the Swedish wrongness before she had it fairly to her face, and she wetted a corner and touched it to the inside of her own wrist and waited. And by the crawling heat that rose there within the hour she had her answer whole. The beautiful white lint had been steeped and dried in the very thing she had already washed out of his dressings. The slow caustic that ate a wound wider under the name of soothing it, and had she been the fond ignorant nurse they took her, for she would have bounded on him with her own loving hands and called down his death and thought it grief. She did not weep, and she did not run to accuse. She trimmed the card square and dated it in her private shorthand, and rolled the whole of the poisoned lint up tight, and dripped a coin of wax across the fold, and pressed her thimble end into the wax for a seal, and laid it in the japanned work-box beside the doctored dressings she had already stripped from him. Another receipt in a box that was filling row upon row, while the men who wrote those receipts believed themselves unwatched. And only then did she stand a moment at the tall window, with her hand flat on the cold glass, looking out at the black shuttered wing across the court where a fire had burned 3 winters gone, and let herself think, for one breath, of a woman who had had no such nose, and no such box, and no one at all. Now, understand what she had made of the marriage by this turn of the year, for it was a strange and secret thing. Above stairs, behind her own locked door, she had a husband climbing back toward his life a little every day, sores closed to shining pink, a hand that could grip, an appetite, an hour by candlelight when he would talk low of horses and old books and she would rule her chart. And below stairs the county was still being fed. At Crispin Vale's own smiling table, the tale of a Marquess sinking fast. Not long now, the poor scarred wretch, and it suited Mercy exactly that they go on believing it, for a dead man cannot be murdered twice, and every week the family thought Julian dying was a week they did not try again in earnest. So she became, God forgive her, the keeper of his sickness as well as his cure. On the mornings Crispin's charming visits were looked for. She would go up early and dress her husband not in health, but in the appearance of its opposite, a shadow of hearth-ash brushed gray into the hollows of his cheek above the scars, a paleness worked over his lips, the loose bottle-green banyan hung slack on him, and the good linen hidden, and she would set him bent and shawled and low in the great chair by the window, with a rug across his knees. And when the cousin came in warm and sorrowful to sit 10 minutes and take the measure of the dying, he found a wasted recluse who could barely lift his ruined hand from the arm of the chair. And he went away satisfied, and did his sums again and made them come out right, and never once knew that the moment his heels were on the stair the Marquess sat up straight and washed the ash from his own face and asked his wife what she had learned that day, for she had begun by then to learn a very great deal. It commenced over nothing, over household linen, as the deepest things in a great house always commence over nothing. The sheets of the east presses were rotting of damp unused, And Mercy, being now nominally the mistress, asked the housekeeper for the keys to sort them, and Mrs. Aldern, that spare, upright woman of 60, with a face shut like a closed account book and a heavy ring of keys at her chatelaine, looked at the new little Marchioness a long moment with something moving far back in her eyes, and unlocked not only the presses but, by slow degrees over the following days, the whole memory of the house. For Mrs. Aldern had kept Fenwarren's books for 30 years, and a house that is run well is a house that writes everything down, and nothing had ever been thrown away. In the still-room presses, in the deep drawers no one had opened since the old troubles, lay the ledgers of the years, the diet books and the dressing books and the cellar books and the visitor's book, each in its ruled columns in the housekeeper's own iron hand, and Mercy Lovell, who read ledgers the way she read seams, sat down among them by one candle after the house slept. And there the first death rose up out of the paper and stood at her elbow. For it was all there. 3 years and more gone, before the fire, the first Marchioness of Fenwarren, a bride herself once, had begun a long, slow illness that the dressing book named without knowing what it named. A small hurt to the arm that would not heal, then putrid sores that spread and would not close. 19 months of them set down week by week in the same hand. And against those months the dressing book showed the very thing Mercy knew in her own bones. Dressings changed twice daily, morning and night. From the case of the same soft-spoken attendant, Mr. Dampier, a squat brown gallipot of dark salve carried up and carried down, the diet book showed the strong meat and the wine ordered to build a lady who only wasted. The account showed the physician sent for at the end and sent away helpless, and then, in the housekeeper's iron hand gone for once unsteady, the black-edged line. Her Grace died this night, and under it, 3 days later, the fire and the east wing lost, and her Grace's remains, and the young lord's hands and face so cruelly burned, and the county's verdict written in over the top of it all by other mouths, that the Marquess, in a madness of grief or of drink, had fired his own house upon his own wife and marked himself doing it. 19 months down the same ladder Mercy's own husband had lately been dragged down. The same twice daily dressings, the same hand carrying the same gallipot, and at the foot of both, not grief, but a fire to burn the evidence into legend. But the ledger that stopped her heart in her chest was the visitor's book, that plain register of who slept under Fenwarren's roof, for she laid her finger on the columns and walked them year by year, and the pattern came up off the page as clean and cold as a chalked line. Mr. Crispin Vale, the fair cousin, come to stay. And there he was, resident at Fenwarren from 2 months before the first Marchioness's first sore was ever dressed, resident all through her 19 months of dying, resident until 3 weeks after her funeral, and then gone. Gone clean away, through the years that followed, the healthy years, the years when Julian Ash, scarred and broken and blamed, had nonetheless lived, his old burns silvering and quiet. No sore upon him, gone down the columns, not a night under that roof, and then, not 14 months since, come again to stay. Resident at Fenwarren from 2 months before the Marquess's old healed scars first broke open and festered, and resident, without a night away, from that hour to this. 2 declines, 19 months, and this last cruel year, 2 beds of unhealing sores, 2 dressings cases carried twice a day, and one single guest, present for the whole of both and absent from every well-day between. A man who arrived like a season and each time brought the rot with him, and each time, the first time, left only after the fire. The dead, Mercy wrote that night in her own book, keep the best accounts of all, for they cannot be paid to forget. And still she wanted more than a pattern, for a pattern hangs no man. So she went, with the housekeeper's grave leave and the housekeeper's own keys, into the Black Wing itself. They had shuttered and barred it after the fire, and left it 3 years to the weather and the birds. And she went in by day with a lantern and Mrs. Aldern at her shoulder, over fallen char and under beams the fire had licked and left, into the burnt bones of the room where the first Marchioness had died, and there, half under a collapsed press, scorched and rain-stained but not consumed, Mercy Lovell found the thing that could speak. It was a woman's bodice, or the ruin of one. The good silk of it burnt to lace down one side, but the boned foreparts come through, and Mercy knelt in the ash and read it as she would read any garment brought to her bench, and it told her 3 things in the plain language of its own making. It told her, by the char, that the fire had come at it from the doorway side and the window side both at once, low and fast, the way a fire comes that has been set with intent in 2 places, and not the way a hearth log rolls out on a single spark. It told her, by a thing she found fused into the scorch of the doorframe near where the bodice had fallen, the melted remains of a stout iron staple and a bar, that the door of that room had been barred from the outside, that a woman already too weak from 19 months of poison to rise from her bed had been shut in behind a barred door, and the room lit around her. And it told her, when she carried it to the light and set beside it in her mind the very scars she dressed every night, the truth of her own husband's hands, for the burns Julian Ash carried were not the burns of a man who flees a fire. They ran up the fronts of his forearms and were seared deep into both his palms, the marks of a man who had seized hold of something burning and would not let go, who had beaten and torn at a barred door until his hands cooked on the iron of it, reaching through the flame for the wife they would afterwards swear he had murdered. She had read that much off his skin the first hour she knelt to pin his cuff, before she knew a single name. Now the burnt house set it back to her in its own tongue and made it law. She sat down among the ashes of the room and read the whole of that night aloud to herself and to the silent housekeeper, off the scars of a man 3 years condemned for it, every wound in its order, the palms that gripped the iron, the forearms that shielded the face, the cheek and neck the fire took when the beam came down, and Mrs. Aldern, who had kept her ledger face shut for 30 years and had believed, God help her, half the county's verdict herself, stood in the burnt doorway and wept at last for a master she had wronged in her heart, and then she wiped her face and said, there was a nurse, my lady, Bet Cardew, that tended her grace those last months, and was turned off the week after the fire without a character, and paid to go. And I have grieved these 3 years that I did not ask her why she went so frighted, and if your ladyship means to do what I begin to think you mean to do, then here is my hand, and here are my keys, and here is every book in this house, and God forgive us all that we let it lie so long. Now Mercy Lovell had a pattern, and a barred door, and a husband's scars turned from confession into acquittal, but she was still, when all was said, a shopwoman one winter wed, and she knew as well as she knew her own needle that no magistrate in England would hang a gentleman on a seamstress's reading of a burnt bodice. She needed proof of the kind that men who never look at hands are none the less obliged to respect. Proof written in a public register in the poisoner's own hand, and being an apothecary's, a tailor-surgeon's daughter, she knew exactly where such a register was kept and by whose law. For corrosive sublimate, the caustic that had eaten 2 beds of sores, is a deadly poison of commerce, and no druggist may sell it across his counter without entering it in his poison register. The buyer's name and hand, the quantity, the stated purpose, the date, all of it set down and signed by law against exactly this. And so one raw bright morning the little Marchioness had the gig put to and drove herself the 7 cold miles to the market town, and walked into the village druggist's shop, and stood among the blue bottles she had been raised among, and told the wary old man behind the counter whose daughter she was, named her father, the layer-out and mender of soldiers whose name the trade still knew, and watched the wariness turn to the Freemasonry of the craft, and she asked to see, on a matter touching a poisoning, his register of the sales of corrosive sublimate for these 7 years past. And there it was, in the ruled book, in the sleek, careful, ink-stained hand she knew from 100 labels on 100 gallipots, the signature of Mr. Dampier, surgeon attendant to the house of Fenwarren, entered and entered and entered again, corrosive sublimate, for the canker, for the rats, in steady, careful quantities, a little and a little, so as never to alarm. And Mercy laid her father's trade against the dates, and saw them fall into the 2 black seasons of the ledgers at home like a key into a lock. A cluster of buying through the 19 months the first Marchioness lay dying. Then nothing. Nothing through the long healthy years when the guest was gone. Then the buying begun again 2 months before Julian's scars broke open, and steady ever since. And last of all, dated but 11 days before a Proxy stood up in a distant church to marry a nobody to a dying lord. One purchase larger and fiercer than all the rest, a strong caustic bought against a wedding, to make, she understood, a strong finish. The old druggist, when she had walked him through it, went gray and then went firm, for a poisoner had made a fool and an unwitting accomplice of him under his own roof, and he made her 3 fair copies of the entries in his own hand and certified each one true beneath his shop seal, and shook her hand at the door like a colleague, and said, "Your father would know his girl this day." One thing more she sent for, the farthest and the slowest, a letter carried south by the mail to the town where Mrs. Aldern believed the turned-off nurse had gone to a married sister, and Mercy wrote it plain, that a new Marchioness of Fenwarren, no friend to the old order of that house, was gathering the truth of the first Marchioness's death, and had need of what Bet Cardew knew and would see her righted and safe. And in the fullness of weeks the answer came back, and it came back sworn, taken down before a justice of the peace and witnessed, for Bet Cardew had carried her stone 3 years and was sick to death of the weight of it. She swore that she had nursed her grace faithfully and watched her die by inches of sores that no honest sickness ever made, that her mistress would rally and gain and grow bright whenever the fair cousin Mr. Vale went away upon his travels, and would sink again within the week of his returning, so regular that the poor lady had come to dread his very step in the passage, that the dressings her grace wore came never from Bet's hands, but only ever from Mr. Vale's own, or from the attendant Dampier's, brought up ready in the brown gallipot, and no other suffered to touch them, and that the week after her mistress burned, Mr. Crispin Vale had put into Bet's hand a full year's wages in gold, and had told her, smiling, that she would leave Fenwarren that day and speak of its affairs to no living soul, and that if ever she opened her mouth upon what she had seen he would see her taken up for the poisoning herself. For who would believe a nurse against a gentleman? And she had gone in terror, and held her tongue 3 years, and it had near killed her. And she would come, the deposition ended, she would come and say it to their faces and be glad. So the box was full. And on a night near the end of it, Mercy Lovell carried the whole of the reckoning up to her husband, and laid it open on the deal table between them. The sealed and dated dressings, row on row, the poisoned gift lint, the druggist's certified copies, the 2 black ledgers, the nurse's sworn word, and the scorched bodice with its barred door staple, and she read him, quietly and in order, the story of the night he had spent 3 years believing was his own crime, and gave him back his hands as a rescuer's hands, and gave him back his wife as a woman murdered under his roof by the smiling man who dined below, and gave him back, hardest of all, his own innocence, which despair had long since talked him out of. And Julian Ash did not weep. Something worse and better than weeping happened in him. The just man that grief had drugged asleep 3 years woke up behind his eyes and stood. And he sat for a long while with his ruined hand flat upon the burnt silk of the bodice, and then he said, "Not for the world will this be done in a family parlor." For she had counseled caution, a quiet word to a magistrate, a private taking, and he told her, with the cold, clean certainty of a man who has met these people over a lifetime, exactly how a family parlor would end. The aunt in gentle tears, the cousin's sorrowing voice naming it the sad hysteria of a low-born bride overwrought with nursing. A doctor of their own choosing summoned to shake his head, and then one dark night, he said, "My dear, you would take a fall on these stairs, as better women than either of us have taken falls on stairs, and it would be very much regretted. No, if it was to be spent, it would be spent in the open, before the whole county, where no smile could unsay it and no accident could catch it up again after. And," he said, and here the grim ghost of a smile touched the unscarred side of his mouth, "they have built us the very room. For under the old lord's will, the will that had required him wed before Lady Day on pain of losing all, there was to be a great public reading and settling of the Fenwarren estate, the whole county summoned through the winter to the Long Hall to hear the disposition of the lands, and Crispin Vale had built the day for his own triumph. Certain the Marquess would be dead, or all but dead, beneath the roof, and the widow easy managing. Certain he would stand in that hall as master in all but name. They would let him have his day. Quietly, then, and by night, Mercy Lovell and her risen husband made ready the rest of it. Sir Hugh Marden, the county magistrate, an iron-gray stern old man of 65 with heavy brows and a cold, honest eye, was brought secretly across the moor after dark and walked exhibit by sealed exhibit through the japanned box, and being a careful man he did not take a young woman's word for any of it, but turned her shorthand chart of the wounds against the dates on the wax seals and found them tally to the day, and questioned her hard and found her answers harder, and took down the housekeeper's deposition and the druggist's, and grew over the small hours, from a septic humoring a great house into a hound with the scent square in its nose, and he had 2 of the doctored dressings opened before witnesses, and sent under seal to 2 physicians of repute, who certified in writing that the linen was charged with corrosive sublimate in strength enough to hold any wound on earth open, and rotting for as long as a man liked. And on the last night of all, the very night before the county was to come, Mercy's own quiet watching bore its last black fruit. For a maid loyal to Mrs. Aldern carried up word that she had heard the cousin low in the still room passage requiring of the attendant a strong finish, and quickly, before the house fills, and so when Dampier crept up that midnight with a fresh charged dressing to make an end of the Marquess before his day of triumph could go wrong, he found not a dying man, but the Marquess sitting up in a made bed with a candle lit, and the magistrate's own men waiting, and the last poisoned dressing was taken from his hand and sealed in wax before 3 signing witnesses, while the ink of the physician's certificate was scarcely dry, the final receipt, dated to the hour, in a box grown heavy with them. Then the county came. They came through the snow the whole white morning. The carriages of the neighborhood wound up the moor road to Fenwarren under a low iron sky, and they filled the great candle-lit long hall with its huge cold stone hearth and its dark staring portraits, and its heavy refectory table where the old lord's parchment will lay ready, coming, most of them, half for the estate and half to glimpse the monster of the county, the mad Marquess who burned his wife, laid out dying at last. And at the head of the room stood Crispin Vale in claret and gold, with his quizzing glass and his warm, untroubled smile, master of the day, and beside him the dowager in her weeds, and near the wall the soft-spoken attendant with his leather case, none of them yet knowing that the case had been quietly emptied of its caustic and its owner quietly held since dawn. And when the county was seated and the murmur high, and the lawyer clearing his throat over the will, the great doors at the end of the hall were opened, and instead of a dying recluse carried down to hear his lands disposed, the Marquess of Fenwarren walked into his own hall on his own feet, upright, unhurried, in a well-cut coat of black, his silvered scars bare to every eye, and neither hidden nor hung with any mask, his color good and his dark eyes wide awake and level, and on his arm in plain dove gray stood the little seamstress bride the county had never troubled to look at, and the murmur died in the hall as a candle dies, all at once, and Mercy Lovell felt across the sudden silence one face turned to them that had gone, under its charm, the color of tallow. Julian did not go to his chair. He walked the length of his hall in the ringing quiet and stopped before the magistrate and said in a voice pitched to carry to the cold hearth at the far end, Sir Hugh, "Before my uncle's will is read and the estate of Fenwarren settled, I ask that the accounts of this household be read first, for they touch the settling more nearly than any here yet knows." And Sir Hugh Marden rose in his place with the japanned workbox on the table before him, and read them. It took near 40 minutes, and no one in that hall moved through the whole of it. He read the druggist's certified register of corrosive sublimate, bought steady across 2 seasons of dying, and gone in the well years between, every entry over the signature of Mr. Dampier there present. He read the 2 physicians' certificate that the dressing sealed from the Marquess's own body had held caustic enough to keep any living wound from ever closing. He held up the scorched bodice and the fused iron of the barred door, and read Mercy's plain account of a room fired in 2 places about a woman too poisoned to rise, and read across the Marquess's bared and living scars, before the eyes of the county that had condemned them, the plain proof that those were a rescuer's hands, burned gripping the iron of a door, barred from without. And last he read the sworn and witnessed word of Bet Cardew, brought quietly into the hall to stand while it was read, that a wife had mended whenever one guest left the house and sickened whenever he returned, and that the dressings came only ever from Mr. Vale's hand or his man's, and that she had been paid in gold and threatened out of the county to keep it dark. And the county, turning, watched what Mercy had known they would watch, the charm going off Crispin Vale in patches like ice going off a thawing pond, a little at his mouth first and then about the eyes, the warm smile trying to hold and cracking, the easy color failing, until at the last, in the dead middle of the magistrate's level voice, the master of Fenwarren set down his glass of canary upon the refectory table with a small brittle click that everyone in that silent hall heard, and rose, and walked without haste toward the great doors as a man walks who has decided to be somewhere else, and found them shut, and found before them, shrugging off their borrowed footmen's coats, the magistrate's own men. And Crispin Vale stood a moment with his back to the whole assembled county, and then he turned round, and his face, before he had said one word, did the confessing for him, in front of every soul that had come through the snow, and there was no unsaying it ever after. It was the attendant who gave them the words to hang it on. Taken that dawn at the still room door with a fold of caustic-steeped lint sewn into the lining of his own case, Mr. Dampier weighed his thin neck against his loyalty for about the length of one interview with Sir Hugh, and then he gave the whole of it, flat and complete. Both poisonings and both fires, the first Marchioness worked down through 19 months and shut behind a barred door, and, burnt to hide the sores, the Marquess's old healed scars reopened and fed caustic twice a day this last year to make a slow public death of the arsonist the county already hated. All of it done at the direction and in the pay of Mr. Crispin Vale, who had meant, the moment Julian Ash was buried under a contrived will beside the wife he was blamed for, to govern the whole of Fenwarren through the estate as he had always intended. First through a dead cousin's widow, and, when a kinless bride had served her turn as a tidy, convenient widow, through no one at all. As for the dowager, that aunt who had sat in her weeds and wept so gently and pressed the bride's hand and called her a brave, good girl, no paper carried her name, and no writing put the poison in her hand, and so she escaped the law. But she did not escape the county, which is a slower court and a longer sentence, and within the season she removed herself from that country to a set of cold rooms in a spa town, where she was received everywhere and trusted nowhere and never, to the end of her days. Left alone in a sick friend's chamber, for the story went before her as such stories do, and every hostess in the place knew to keep the caudle cup out of that lady's kind hands. And there, you might think, the account is closed, the poisoners taken, the innocent man stood up in his own hall with his lands and his name and 3 stolen years given back to him. And it is closed. But it is not quite ended, for there remained the one debt in the whole business that could not be discharged by any magistrate, which was what the Marquess of Fenwarren owed the woman who had knelt to pin his cuff and read the truth off his skin when no physician in England had troubled to. He did not pay it with a declaration. He was too honest a man, now that he was himself again, and too clear-eyed about how she had come to him, to mistake gratitude for a right, and so, when the spring came at last to the moor and the black wing was being pulled down for the light to come in, Julian Ashey walked into her sewing-room one morning, where she sat at the long deal table among her cloth and shears, and he laid before her not a love letter and not a jewel but a folded deed, and a second paper beside it, and he said, "This first is a good stone shop house in the market town and funds enough for a life. In your sole name, yours whatever comes. And this second is a petition of annulment, drawn and lacking only our 2 signatures. You were sold to me, madam," he said, "without ever being asked, and I find I will not keep what was sold. There is your liberty, whole, in your own hand, and no debt on it, and you may walk out of this house today the richer for having saved a stranger, and think of Fenwarren no more." And only when he had said that, and meant it, and she had seen that he meant it, did he ask her the other thing, lo, that now that she was free and it could never again be any man's bargain or any lawyer's terms, whether she would consider staying and being his wife in earnest and of her own choosing, for he had loved her, he said. Since the first hour a bought bride knelt down in the cold and read his ruined hands rightly and asked no credit for the reading, he did not want a nurse, and he did not want a Marchioness. He wanted the one person alive who could not be deceived, at his table or anywhere else, and who had walked into a house that would have barred its door against her and quietly saved his life for nothing. And Mercy Lovell, who had faced down a whole county in a candlelit hall without her hands once shaking, felt them shake now over her own workbox, And she set down her needle, and she gave him, of course, her terms. For she was still herself, and always would be, that her mother's pattern and wound book should stay in that house openly and be taught and not hidden, that there should be built, over the door in her own name, an infirmary and a sewing school for the estate villages, so that the girls of the moor with quick hands and no dowry should have the trade her father gave her, that Mrs. Aldern should be pensioned in honor and never turned out, and that the burnt wing should be rebuilt, not shuttered and dark, but full of windows and light. And the Marquess of Fenwarren said that he had rather keep house on her terms than reign on his own, and they were married again in the May of that year, quietly, by their own choosing this second time, and in the front pew, where the county could all see them and understand the new order of that house, sat Mrs. Aldern, the housekeeper, with her keys, and the old druggist who had shaken a colleague's hand across his counter, and Bet Cardew, the turned-off nurse, come home at last and righted, wearing a good gown for the first time in 3 years. If this fireside is one you would sit at again, you know the small kindness that keeps the candles lit, and I am always glad of the company, and I would dearly like to know, before we bank the fire, which moment you would have risen from your chair for. The 2 dressings changing places under the same watching eyes while the wax dried, or that small brittle click of a wine glass set down on the refectory table as the last receipt was read and a smiling man understood at last that someone had been counting all along. Tell me that in the comments. And tell me, too, what town or what country you are listening from tonight. For this fire reaches farther every week, and I do love to know how far the candles carry. The Fenwarren Infirmary stands on the moor road yet, and for 30 years the Marchioness kept its books and taught its girls to read before you touch, and to write your workings fair. And in the rebuilt still room, where the new great window lets the morning in across the very place the dark wing used to stand, there hangs framed upon the wall a sheet of ruled paper covered in hooks and dots, in a private shorthand no one else could read, the chart of a dying man climbing back to his life, joint by joint and day by day. And beneath it, set down for whoever comes after in a clear round hand that learned its letters at a shop counter, one single line, the skin keeps its accounts, and a clean hand reads them true. Next Thursday, another door opens on another woman the world had priced too cheap, a linen draper's daughter this time, and a locked conservatory in a house of secrets, and a will that every soul in the family had read except the one page that mattered, and it is waiting for you by the fire whenever you are ready to come and sit down.